Hi, everyone. Good evening. Sorry for that feedback. We're just waiting a few more minutes while we let some other people into the room. We'll begin in a couple of minutes. But welcome. Okay, I think I'll make a start now. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to spotlight myself. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's evening here in London, and my name is Raisa Kabir, and I'm curator of talks and events at the Photographers Gallery. We're delighted to be here with artists Raisa Kabir and Raju. Tonight's event is part of a wider program of public talks and special events for From Here to Eternity, Sunil Gupta, a retrospective, the new exhibition of the artist's work, which opened at the gallery last month. Raisa Kabir is a London-based artist working across language, textiles, performance, sound, image, and video. Key themes in her work include cultural politics of cloth, labor, and embodied geographies. They recently showed at Indigo Matter Gallery earlier this autumn, and there's a video of that work which I will circulate through in a link in the chat function after this. Raju is typically London-based too, but is calling in from Mexico tonight. They use art, pedagogy, and activism to forge creative survival. Current interests are around economies, care, and resistance. They currently have an exhibition about food and politics entitled Recipes for Resistance, which is on right now at Ort Gallery in Birmingham. There's also publication as part of that, which is available at Taco and can be purchased online. I'll also circulate a link to that in the chat box after this. Anyway, tonight, Raisa and Raju reflect on queer and trans health in the context of care and survival in the particular form of labor impressed upon queer people of color in institutional spaces, including our own here now. Since the 1970s, when Sunil first began his creative practice, his work has concerned itself with the political in a way that his own life has always been political, moving across intersections of race, geography, sexuality, and gender. Together, Raisa and Raju will further examine these issues within specific bodies of work in Sunil's practice, in that of their own, and in relation to trans activism and resistance. Tonight's event is a little different from some of our past ones and will include pre-recorded elements from the gallery. After my introduction, we will move directly into some footage from that for about 20 minutes. The chat box will be open throughout, and Raisa and Raju will be checking that. So please send your comments and questions there, and we will respond to them in the break. After about 15 minutes of contributions from you, we will move into the second half of the film, which will last another 20 minutes or so before we wrap up with some closing remarks from the artists and from myself. Again, you can submit your questions through the chat feature here, or they can be posed directly in that interval by electronically raising your hand using the Zoom function here, and we will then ask you to unmute yourself. At the moment, you shouldn't be able to unmute yourself. We will do our best to respond to each of you. However, given the number of people here today, we'll unlikely be able to get to everyone. The event should last a total about an hour or so. Please note we are recording this, so if you do not wish to be filmed, you can turn off your camera. Before we start, I would like to thank the Durjoy Bangladesh Foundation for the commitment to the gallery. The Durjoy Bangladesh Foundation was established in 2018 to support the ambitions of artists and art practitioners who see the world differently and generate new ways of shaping our future. Thank you again for your support. Additional thank yous to Junia Adeneki, for her work on the film, and to Toby Adebaho for the sound engineering. Lastly, of course, to Raisa Kabir and Raju. Thank you. We are approaching this event in the same way we do all of our public programs, which is with the aim of creating a forum of trust and mutual respect. So please keep that in mind. We look forward to seeing you again here during some of our other online activity, including a symposium on the exhibition later in January, and even more hopefully in person in the gallery. Thank you for joining us. And Raju, Raisa, did you want to say a quick hello?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, everyone. Good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, and we hope that you enjoyed the first half of the film. We did a recorded conversation. Please put in your questions in the chat box, and we're going to pick out some for the break and answer your questions.
I'll move to the film now. Bear with me, there might be a tiny bit of feedback.
Conversation in the Photographers Gallery.
Thanks for inviting me, Raisa. It's always good to be in conversation.
Yeah, queer care and interdependence. I really wanted to speak to Raju about themes because this is something that really runs through the core of both of our practices around the intersections between disability, justice and access to trans healthcare and chronic illness, and the themes that are underpinning in Sunil's work, but we would really love to kind of take that opportunity to expand and maybe offer some criticism or some critical thought around some of these social justice issues. I'm Raisa Kabir. I'm a visual textile and performance artist. I'm a weaver. I work with textiles. I'm also someone who has lived with chronic illness and pain and many different types of autoimmune illnesses. I really think it's really important to bring these elements together that do focus on disability and chronic illness and aren't at the periphery of, art making and art production.
So I'm Raju Rage. I am an artist. I am also an educator, and I have a background in community organisation and activism, specifically around queer and trans and people of colour organising.
Yeah, so me and Raju are here today because I went around the gallery and I got asked to do a performance, and I really felt a performative conversation in the gallery was something that I really wanted to pursue. This is a show about Sunil Gupta, and it's very autobiographical, and that's what's very moving about it. What really came through when I was going around the show were the themes of chronic illness and disability, and the body in relation to queerness, and trans representation, access to trans healthcare, and disability and chronic illness can kind of be interlayered and can be expanded on in our conversation within this exhibition. And yeah, we're going to talk about some key pieces of works that we've picked out. So we're going to start with From Here to Eternity, which I think is behind me here in the gallery. Yeah, so this was a series that Sunil did in 1999, documenting his treatment of his HIV diagnosis. And you wanted to particularly talk about this series as well. I think we both think it's a very moment of extreme vulnerableness, and talks to about spaces of sickness, queer spaces, and those geographies of chronic illness, and also, the kind of boundaries between bodies and queer space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I particularly love this series because it seems to have been a little bit of a departure from his previous work, where he's inserting himself rather than being, the main gaze and being behind the camera. It is vulnerable, but it also, more than that, it also tells us the story of what his personal experiences and his relationship to his illness. I think I particularly like it because of that lived experience. And, you know, when we talk about visibility, for me, it's not just about image or what we capture or like the aesthetic, it's also about the context, which Sunil does very well in his previous works like Christopher Street and so on. But I feel like when we're speaking specifically around illness and health and kind of well-being, it's nice to actually see what someone's lived experience of that is. I also really like the triptych, the diptych, construction of it as well. I really like how that's put across because it does two things, right? You're able to kind of tell more of the story. So it really kind of, that contrast of the clubs. And I think Sunil has spoken about, you know, going to some of those clubs pre the diagnosis and after, and that relationship to how you're not wanted as a body because of illness or being seen as an ill body. And so that relationship, so that's kind of really, it draws your attention, right, of having these contrasted images together. So they're quite provoking. I mean, I prefer the images where they're more captured rather than staged, but in this diptych, you're able to do both, which kind of gives you a nice perspective. I like these pieces for those reasons.
Yeah, and to talk specifically about maybe the isolation that was going on at that time, and also the reliance on his friends and his queer community, and the distinctions there between who he could rely on and how much support he actually needed within his community. And within a lot of the works that I really resonate with Sunil's work is when that depiction of community is really apparent. As, you know, with Christopher Street, it's kind of like early like gay liberation images and the more kind of candid. And these images where he places his own body and his vulnerability within that. And I think the juxtaposition between From Here to Eternity and Homelands, where it's specifically about managing a HIV diagnosis and a chronic illness and treatment between India, Canada and the UK, the uncertainty of being able to have access to healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, you really get the sense that these images are not just about taking photographs, they're also about him grappling with his own experience and that identity of living with HIV, right? That really comes across in these images, that he's battling with that, grappling with that, and trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah, I'm kind of curious how, his process of making these, and to hear more about that actually would be really interesting to kind of know how he decided, whether he just took these images for himself and when he made that decision to put them out there more publicly and why. I mean, it speaks to kind of his work being viewed or being seen as cultural activism. Have that representation? Is it because there was a lack of representation at that time around what people were actually facing in going, with living with HIV? It brings out a lot of questions, right? But then there's also statements. So with the Shroud, the Shroud piece is like a very provocative, powerful statement, next to this club of like the pleasure dome, it's like this pleasure and death and this kind of the necropolitics, or that certain bodies are set up to die, or there's death there, right? This looming over you, and this kind of tension between that and like as a gay body being seen as existing for pleasure, or to give pleasure, or to receive pleasure, right? Which is very much in his earlier works. Yeah, these images really kind of speak to a background, a context, a relationship.
Because his positionality has changed within these particular works. He's no longer taking pictures of subjects, as he did in Exiles and with the pretended family relationships, and this idea of, being an artist, being an activist, and there's a strong thread of activism throughout his work, but this is also kind of contentious idea of the artist and the activist, and the issue of positionality is really important. And I feel like there are some areas where the politics are really apparent, and then there's some areas where the works are about politics, but maybe the subject is removed from their community. And, I really see the oeuvre of Sunil's work documenting his life, his peers, his community, not particularly to be shown in a gallery, and I think that's, the kind of energy is there. And there are different contexts to when he's documenting the politics in the UK, for example, in New York, and what he says about India as well. And yeah, like if we're going to call ourselves artists or activists, and we are working within different communities, perhaps we also need to ask, how does our work to benefit or impact those communities that we're working with?
But I think we're also very interested in kind of, or thinking about survivorship and how we survive within our communities. I mean, his work is political inherently because of that documentation aspect of it. But I think you're right in terms of, I think it was more about a searching or a seeking or a relating to or connecting to, finding these communities and that connection to them. That was his main object or his main intention in creating this work. But then it becomes inherently political because of the fact that it's documenting these really important times and moments. The context that we know now to be very important for our history and our legacy. But for me, the earlier works and some of the ones, Exiles and Pretended Families, it's very much about seeing gay identity within kind of a context, within a community context, within space, right? Which becomes really important to kind of, to know what was happening in that time for people who weren't there, who don't know, who people can look back, or people who were a part of that, who, that wasn't necessarily being captured, So I think, it's very much the personal and political, whether it's set out to be or not. It becomes very political, right, for that reason.
Exiles were done in 1987, and this is a documentation later than his earlier series, where he first went to India and was documenting some relationships, gay and queer people in India. And you see that jump to Exiles where he's now not just searching for community, he's actually participating in it. And what's really arresting for me with these is that it's less voyeuristic and it has the agency of the voice, so the names of the people being photographed and in their own words, and and real critiques around ideas around sex and gayness and Indianness and the kind of colonial projections that might have been put across during that time, and these gay homosocial spaces that actually look a little bit more radical perhaps than people would assume.
For me, Exiles is really important, especially the Jama Masjid image. For me, is very striking, this counter narrative of the West seeing the global South and South Asia as being maybe more hostile or maybe a little bit more backward it kind of counters that narrative because it's very clear, and from the caption of people just having sex on the street within that market space, and very close to a mosque, right? Very close to a religious space, that this is happening, right? So it kind of really does. It really counters that narrative of yes, there's hostility. Yes, there's all globally. There's been persecution around kind of homosexuality, and not just homosexuality, but also, other marginalized identities. But there are also these spaces. These spaces also exist. There's always this resistance that happens. People always want to have sex, Well, desire always exists, right? And desire will always that will find a way. This series for me it's also for me as a diasporic person to see, I have spent time in India and so on, but to kind of see this at this time in the 80s, depicted and what that kind of cultural sexuality was, it's really important to have that documented. But, again, it exists within kind of community. It exists within people around you and how those interactions take place, you know.
And the positionality as well, because these are spaces on the margins, these are spaces in the shadows, but you can there's a palpable sense of an underground community, and there's a real kind of there's a text quoting someone saying, you know, you in the West have your gay clubs and bars and parties, but you know, this is what we have. The politics is there, but there's also the question of positionality. Positionality has changed. They are very different to the way the politics are presented in Pretended Family Relationships, which is a year later in 1988. Sunil's work is so explicitly queer, and we know from Section 28 this affected his career and his ability to have these political artworks out and getting funding from the GLA. Is the juxtaposition between images of protest with the images of people's relationships. Again, he's working with montage to kind of situate that community and that political community. And again, when we're talking about queer care and interdependence, it's like we can't remove these subjects from their community. That's what's really apparent.
Yeah, I wanted to speak about, I don't know if we can move on now, but to the Pre-Raphaelites series, for example, it seems very different, right? Because in the West, in a way, you get more kind of information about what's happening, the politics or what's happening in the wider world. Whereas kind of the Pre-Raphaelites, even exiles, you don't really get that sense of like what's happening with the wider politics. They don't have titles, or they're numbered, right? So they're numbered, so you don't get a sense of who these people are. It's only based on image, it's only based on visuals. And there's one particularly of a trans person or maybe a hijra, I'm not sure how they identify. You don't really get a sense of who they are or how, they're very much kind of individualized, and you don't really see that sense of community. You don't see that sense of trans community. You don't see that sense of kind of trans survivorship, which I know from my experience from being in India. Trans communities have been there for a very long time, and they're able to survive through having those communities, right? So I feel like I don't get the same sense in some of the works around kind of context and community, thinking through, I guess, in relation to kind of like health and well-being and what it takes to kind of to survive in the world. I know as a trans person that it's collective care, it's community, right? That's how you kind of managed to survive. So sorry, I just went off on a bit of a tangent, but I feel like in a way these works kind of connect, in this way of like.
But there's gaps, right? And what's missing is not to say what's missing, but an agency of names and the contextualization of trans people in India and trans communities in India, creating their communities of because they are so outside of having to really exist on the margins, face extreme police brutality, and that relationship to trans communities in South Asia and the crossover there between chronic illness and disability is kind of brushed over.
Yeah, I think you don't get a sense, because I'm sure within India, yes, there might have not been the same healthcare as in the West, for example, with HIV, but then that would mean that there would be community support, right? There would be other ways of finding, mutual aid or finding other ways to kind of support each other. And you don't get that same sense, right? You don't get that sense of like what's happening there. And also we don't get the whole 377 thing, as I think you just kind of touch on there. That law didn't really impact trans people, because trans people are always going to face violence, right? Regardless, there's laws now, even though 377 has been revoked, there's still transphobic laws, right? There's still, the trans community are always going to face violence within India. And you don't really get a sense of that. Like, yes, I understand this kind of Pre-Raphaelites and creating these kind of portraits with the dignity and integrity, but it doesn't really speak accurately to the reality of what happened with 377, that law and those protests around that, the lack of kind of solidarity between gay and trans communities within India as well, the casteism and the classism involved in that as well, in terms of there being much more segregation and distinctions between communities within India and South Asia compared maybe to the West, where anyone can go to a club, right? And there's more mixing between different communities, right?
Yeah. So caste and class are things that need to always be like addressed. And how for people that don't know, Section 377, it was a colonial law. It was across all the empire nations related to the British Empire. 377 exists it used to exist in places like Ireland, Singapore, Malaysia, Myanmar, India, Bangladesh. It exists in this incarnation. It was a law that banned homosexual sex, and was campaigned to be overturned. But in reality, it was only perhaps maybe affecting middle class and upper caste communities, which, even though when it got repealed, it kind of gave a license to, for even more violence towards trans people, and whether it was repealed or not, it didn't really have any bearing on transgender people living in India. And I think that's where the disconnect is this kind of activism shutting an entire perhaps group of people out, and it not having any relation towards working class people and how caste operates in India.
Yeah. I think it also brings up this question of kind of cultural activism versus artists, because I feel like, I don't expect Sunil to have captured, because his work is about being part of community, and he captured the gay community, which he was a part of, and it was his world and his life. I don't expect him to know that of the trans world and the trans communities. That work, that kind of the Christopher Street, the From Here to Eternity, the Pretended Families, that all feels like cultural activism. Even Exiles feels like this cultural activism. But then the Pre-Raphaelites very much feels like kind of artist work or artwork, in terms of creating these portraits and staging them in this way, right? I think it's interesting, because I don't know whether it comes down to, like, is there responsibility as an artist when you're depicting certain marginalized groups or people or communities or not, right? That really came to mind in this conversation, because this image of this trans person, this hetero, I'm not sure who they are or how they identify, is everywhere, right? I can see it's very prominent in the exhibition, right? But then it's kind of like, what is it saying? And then it kind of asks this question of, like, what is the visibility that we need, right? What is the visibility that we need? Because in Sunil's work around HIV and around Christopher Street and Pretended Families, it's very clear that the visibility is also about what is the lived experience, what is the what is happening in those times that becomes important, right? Versus just an image or a portrait of somebody, right? It's like, what is that? What is the visibility that we need as queer and trans and gay communities, right? In the art world or in general, right?
I agree with you, and that it's just interesting to have a series around activism around 377, which was the activism around it excluded trans people, but then to have a trans portrait of someone I don't know what their name is, and it being so prominent. I think that's where that critique maybe is the use of this subject for an issue that doesn't directly impact their lives. And I think that's just that political activism, perhaps, and the contextualization and time stamping, which is seen in other works and done so beautifully and deftly, it just is a little bit eerily not present.
And I think, you come to this exhibition kind of asking these questions of, like, or reflecting on what does this mean? Where are we at as queer and trans people? I kind of think about, I really appreciate the depictions of experiencing and living, with HIV, and having that experience. And then I kind of question, yeah, HIV also affected trans communities in a huge way as well. What are the depictions that we have as trans people about that? I don't really know many. I'm thinking about other artists or other people I know, and how trans communities are captured versus like what's actually going on for us in our worlds and our lived experience, right? So it does begs those questions, and like having the trans person in there, I think there's a lesbian person, bisexual people in there. You kind of want to know more, right? You kind of want to know more, and I think for me, it does ask this question of like, this is very clear that this is a retrospective over 5 decades. There's a lot of work there, but that there's still not so much information. There's not so much around kind of in the kind of cultural activist sense. There's a lot of trans artists. There's a lot of, or not a lot, but there are trans artists. There are people making work about trans identity and so on. But having that kind of that more kind of cultural activist kind of sense of like what's happening with our communities, that documentation of what's going on with our how we're surviving, how we're not surviving, how we're taking care of ourselves, community support, collective care, and all of that. There isn't so much of that out there, really. And that's what I really like about this show, actually, is that it shows all of those materials, right? It's this retrospective, it's the work, it's the photography, but it's also the context, and it's also sharing that personal documentation, that archive as well. So it's kind of like, it's a rounded conversation, I guess, in a way. It's trying to show a more kind of, more complex conversation. But I think there are there's many conversations happening. There's many threads that are drawn out that, that we that need more kind of discussion, right? More conversation around them.
I guess
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just worried about the echo. We just wanted to pause here. So if anyone had any questions, as you mentioned, Raisa and Raju are checking the chat function. I do have a question actually that came directly to me, Raisa and Raju, if you don't mind me reading it aloud. It says, the question comes from Emily, and they're asking, how do you balance the importance of visibility and inclusion of queer and marginalized communities in the cultural discourse with the vulnerability that visibility brings? Does that make sense? And anybody else, if you do have any questions, feel free to raise your hands, or again, you can just submit it through the chat function.
Yeah, and we're having like a comfort break, and if you like think of something, pop it in the box, and we can finish the rest of the film. We can come back to it. It's just important to have a bit of a comfort break. I think I know Raju would probably like to answer that question, but I think what's pertinent to me is that sometimes visibility is violent, and actually sometimes you can't be visible, and it's not possible. But sometimes there isn't a balance, I think. You have to have self-preservation, and it's something about certain types of work by certain types of artists being fetishized or consumed in a way where someone might have to show to be vulnerable, or show, reveal parts of their trauma in a way that is then consumed by an audience that isn't from their community, and there's problematics around that. But those are my first thoughts.
Thanks, Raisa. Are we going to break, or do you want me to answer that? I mean, I can just say thanks, Raisa. I think you answered it really well. But it comes, for me, it's this question of who's representing, right, and who's including, because I think that really impacts how vulnerable people can be, right? For me, I think there's issues around inclusion and kind of around visibility and representation that I think Raisa answered really well.
Yeah, who has the power to be visible and vulnerable? Sometimes it's dangerous to be vulnerable. But Okay. So 5-minute break, and then we'll restart the film, and then hopefully people have questions.
We'll be back in 5 minutes around, but again, as Raisa said, just submit your questions if you do have any. I'm gonna get some water to model the break. Raju, when we come back, I was wondering, I just have a quick question too, because I know you speak about it later in the video, but I wondered if you could speak about working in institutional spaces, and then I guess maybe the times where you've not relinquished, declined to participate or taken back, withdrawn your labor. That's what I mean, withdrawn your labor. I don't know if Bryce is in the room and picked up on that too. Oh, we're getting some questions in. Thank you, not Raha. There's some questions that have come in from the audience. I imagine you're both processing it right now. I've had good feedback that some of you heard me pour water. Sorry about that. So for those who are watching this on YouTube, we're just getting some questions in through the chat function over Zoom.
Yeah, Raju, did you want to respond to any of these questions, or do you think that they'll work once we have the second half of the film?
Yeah, I think that second part of the question is a really interesting one in terms of the differences between the contexts. I think we spoke a little bit about that in the video, and how there are differences between the West and India, but also there are differences between that come into play around race. We spoke, I think it got cut out of the video in the end, but we spoke about how when Sunil came to the UK from this kind of very liberated gay context in the US and Canada, that it was very racist here in the UK, and then there was that aspect to deal with. So yeah, there is across the context there are differences and distinctions that are really important to kind of mention. And then we spoke a little bit about getting to know the community aspects. You don't get so much, or I didn't feel I got so much from the Indian context in that respect. The first part of the question around vulnerability, I mean, that's a good question actually, because there is this thing about how illness is depicted and how we feel we need to depict it, whereas how I feel with Sunil's work, especially with the Homecoming, and with Homecoming in particular, that it's about, as I said, about grappling with this and not necessarily thinking necessarily about where the images are going to go or how they're going to be seen. It's more kind of very authentic and honest in this kind of exploration, which makes it vulnerable, I guess. And I guess that speaks to Hannah's question maybe about the visibility. I think that's a really hard one for us to answer. I'm not Sunil, so I don't know. But I think that I feel that he wasn't necessarily thinking about where the image was going later, or hadn't come to that point. And I asked that question. I'm curious to hear from Sunil. At what point did he decide to make that visible? So I also have the same question, so I can't answer that one. But I feel like that work is quite honest in terms of, like, you can see that Sunil's grappling with his illness and feels compelled to kind of take these images for himself first and foremost.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and they're not. Oh, I think we both Raju. Sorry about that. I think they're not just self-portraits, are they? That they're diptychs, and that's what's super interesting about them. And Sunil does have lots of lovely self-portraits where he's vulnerable with his family, and in his community and with partners, and there is always an intimacy in Sunil's work, and that's what's so appealing about it, and so what's the word, relatable, and you can feel like you're becoming close with his subjects. I think when we talk about visibility, safety, and community in terms of like disability or illness, I think what we're trying to do is situate and place the queer body, or like the queer space, and how does disability and sickness fit into that space, and what does that vulnerability do, and is it rejected or is it not rejected? There are a number of works, Homecomings, which Raju said, which I think we've shown some images in the film. Again, these diptychs, I think it's really important that there's vulnerability, and it's positioned he positions himself within these spaces and these diptychs, and it has a narrative, and it has an essay to it. And then I think we talk about later in the next part of the film, he has a film called A World Without Pity, and again that's talks about that vulnerability of being diagnosed with living with HIV in India as someone who has just come from Britain and is Canadian, and it kind of tracks that kind of that triple diasporic experience that Sunil has.
Mm. I also wanted to just kind of just to add that the vulnerability isn't just about the body, because it's also speaking about vulnerability of the community, and that's seen in kind of Pretended Families as well, right? Where, we're speaking about the fact that the Clause 28 is really impacting the community, but also Sunil as an artist making work. So kind of making work in light of that violence is also vulnerable and is also precarious. So it's kind of linked together. So it's not just about the ill or sick body, it's also about the politics of the context making us vulnerable and precarious as well.
Should I
Shall we
resume?
move on?
Yeah, let's go.
There's going to be some interference again. 1 second, everyone. Bear with me.
Conversation around them.
I guess it's about building upon, yes, Sunil's work is anti-racist and is talking about and documenting and researching a particular British South Asian experience as a diasporic Indian Canadian artist, and that documentation is really valuable and is part of this larger kind of conversation movement that was happening. But I do think it's important to kind of, just draw out those outlines of where things need to be alluded to or drawn around. That, yes, this can be a documentation of South Asian or brown experience, and the works are gay and they are South Asian and they are queer and they are about illness and disability in some ways, and in some ways there is a lot of homonormativity, and they are surrounding and pivoted around the cis body, and just how we can have works that are political but also and in some ways really really radical and groundbreaking, and in some ways it's really important to still just underline ways in which the works operate maybe in a context to the politics and activism that's happening in 2020. That's hugely around trans activism and access to healthcare, and maybe a politics that isn't just around the cis body and isn't just around certain types of caste or people who have ownership to land. Just trying to elevate that conversation a bit more around what politics mean today.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think having these non-cis gay bodies in the exhibition raise those questions, right? Of what are those narratives? What are those stories? What is happening around that, right? In this context now that we're living in, and me thinking about my own practice, but also my own life as a transgender person who's chronically sick, and I have these questions around, what is the, or there's this huge kind of discussion around visibility and representation as well, right? And usually that means being reduced to an image or an aesthetic, right? So it's like, and trans people do that themselves as well, right? We also want to depict ourselves in ways that we can celebrate and look good and share portraits and all of that, and that's all good, but there is something beneath that as well, like what's happening in our communities, what's happening around the laws, that are making it harder for trans people to access gender affirming surgeries and treatments and identity and employment and housing, and and how COVID impacts that even more and isolates marginalized people even more. There are these big questions around what's happening, and I don't know if taking a portrait is enough, right? To speak to that, to speak to these really important issues that we're experiencing, similar in India right now, and what's happening. I'm hearing, because I know a lot of trans activists there, that trans people need to survive in community, and so COVID has really isolated them so much more, and to the point where nearly everyone is getting COVID within trans communities, because they need to see each other and they need to function. They can't isolate from each other, right? So there are a lot of issues for the trans community and for the queer community, right? There's also this, it's become kind of cool or trendy to speak about queerness in institutional kind of settings. but then we're still dealing with a lot of problems within our communities, right? So it's kind of like, how do we hold these two things together? I think about that as an artist, because I'm also, a lot of my work is about the issues that our communities face, right? But then it's like, but then you're putting that in a gallery, or then you have to make it palatable to some way to an audience for them to enjoy that work. And what is our responsibility, right? I think, cultural activism, I think it's really interesting, this kind of discussion about whether you're a cultural activist or an artist, or that relationship, because it is, again, about where do we situate our work, but it becomes easier now to put work in galleries than to have a community space, right? For example, like, how is that possible? How is that? That's just bizarre to me now, that it's less, there's a really strange relationship there between kind of representation and visibility and making political work, right? That I think, I appreciate, obviously it's really important to see this work in public spaces and to have access and to know it's there and, and appreciate it. But there's also the other work, when your community doesn't go to those galleries or can't access those spaces to see the work, what does that mean, right? So it's kind of like this question of where is the work situated?
Yeah, and I want to know if, works like Exile or the Pre-Raphaelites have been shown in India, and how, it's the perennial question, how does art directly impact and support people's lives on the ground, and as you said, people, I do believe, and have access to certain galleries, especially in a South Asian context where art gallery spaces are so elitist and really inaccessible and shut a lot of people out. And we know that actually some forms of art, a lot of forms of art, are about surviving and resisting, and they get to go undocumented. No one takes pictures of them. No one documents the real kind of the ugliness of actually like what it means to take care of an ill body or survive, an assault or an attack, or showing up for people. That isn't always like documented, and it isn't always an art. And I think that's where in the context of community and interdependence, and I guess shedding a bit of veneer of this kind of like, you're an artist and you make it all on your own and things like that. But the series of From Here to Eternity and Homelands kind of cuts through that, and it becomes clear that to survive this and live this means you are dependent on people, and the politics of dependence is something that I know we're both work on, and it runs through our work as well, and how we contextualize disabled artists, or even the politics of dependence, even in our pandemic world that's happening now. Just the way that narrative runs, and actually what is seen as artworthy and what is actually just the daily practice and the daily politics of the personal of staying alive and keeping going and keeping your peers going and the people that you love and care about.
Yeah, and in From Here to Eternity, it's really clear that also Sunil is also being critical, right? He's also been critical of that gay community who once embraced him as this, sexual body, South Asian body, whatever, right? And then now, because of his HIV diagnosis and his illness, he's now being excluded. And From Here to Eternity, that criticality is really clear, right? That he's questioning his own community in this way.
No, completely. And there's just this crossover here when we depict, a political artwork around queer rights, and then when we're talking about HIV and in terms of queer community, we never really frame it as disability rights or disability justice. And the way we frame chronic illness and living with a HIV diagnosis, the ways in which there is that intersection perhaps isn't explored as much in terms of able-bodiedness, ideas around queerness, and the fact that queer disabled people exist, and a huge amount of queer and LGBT people are living with a disability or living with HIV in ways that perhaps impact their lives a lot more, perhaps now when antiviral drugs are more readily available, but to whose communities are they available to, and then we come back to perhaps trans communities in global south countries and the ways in which that health and that sickness is manifested.
Yeah, and it's also about how disability and illness is represented, right? Do we see images of, disabled and chronically ill people who are celebrating their lives and who are getting, surviving in their day-to-day, or like doing something that's not based on their disability or illness, right? So it's also the way that illness and disability is often depicted can be very limiting, right? Like in some ways it's important to show the struggle and the battle with health, like to have that, like we said earlier, to not just have all these positive images all the time of like, yeah, we want to see the reality of what that is, especially when it's taboo, especially when HIV and AIDS was so taboo as well, right? You had to present a certain image of yourself that you didn't have HIV, or that you were really, doing well, so those images are important. But then I'm also, thinking about, well, what kind of other images do we see of chronically ill and disabled people, right? We don't necessarily see these everyday images, it's not just kind of a norm, right? And then, there's these norms about kind of able-bodiedness and living up to what it means to have an LGBTQIT, plus identity, but, there's not much kind of diversity within that, right?
Completely. And with a lot of chronic illnesses and chronic pain, we're talking about invisible disabilities. If you're living with a virus, or have a long-term blood condition, or have rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia, these are things that aren't inherently visible in the ways in which society, underpins and imagines the disabled body, and the kind of just the juxtapositions between that kind of and I hate to say the word ugliness, but like the realities of living and surviving with chronic illness, and then how that is aligned with queer identity. And this is what From Here to Eternity does. It has like the queer spaces, the gay male spaces that Sunil is now shut out of as a sick body, is kind of unwanted, and him managing that very visceral treatment and blood transfusions and antiviral drugs, and that the way that those bodies and sickness just isn't present in the gay male club space, that becomes really apparent. And the work we were talking about is it's a video of The World Without a Pity, which is a beautiful interlayered film with text, and describes Sunil's coming to terms with, or realisation and receiving the diagnosis whilst he's in India, and questioning whether he's going to have access to the right treatment and the drugs whilst he's there. And the fact that he was 40, there's issues around, age, queer aging, and being displaced from your communities once you're not in that club space anymore. So then it's where do you go from there, in terms of queer and trans aging and community, and building those alternative networks of resistance. I don't know if you wanted to talk more about that.
Yeah, and you see this move away from that club space that's depicted in kind of, or that kind of gay male space that's depicted in Sun City, for example, with a lot of these kind of able bodies, very kind of, very able sexualized bodies in masculine bodies, in this way, to kind of moving more to kind of like this interdependence model of like his friends, his family, who he then had to rely rely on, right? And he speaks about how he then had to really rely on his networks and his friends and his family. But then also about, I think he also spoke about this crisis of being 40, right? And having this diagnosis, but then also how that related to his career, right? And where he saw himself as a practitioner, as an artist, right? And where he would want to be. He does speak publicly about having this crisis in the way of that queer aging, but then also thinking about how he needed to live his every day of his life. It changed his perspective on life and living, right? And what he takes for granted. And I guess, there is something that speaks to me personally around that, because I'm in my 40s, I'm trans, I'm queer and trans aging, and thinking about, where looking at peers or looking at the model or the system of the art world and how, how these frameworks work and how that's so opposing to like being queer and being trans, right? So you can't fit into these models in the same way, right? And there's a direct correlation as to why there's a lack of these representations and depictions and artists within these structures, right? For that reason, because we don't really fit within those structures. So I think Sunil's works also kind of speaks to that, in that period of him exploring his HIV diagnosis. It's not just about the HIV diagnosis, it's about so much more, and it reveals so much more that becomes important to question about our LGBTQ IT communities, about the art world, about our networks and our what we rely on and what our resources for support and care. It goes beyond kind of just looking at HIV, which is why I think it's so important for that reason. It's a questioning as well, right? I wanted to mention a performance that we did in Kochi in Kerala in 2018 for the Biennale, and it was basically a friend, Aryan Krishnan, a queer person in India, organized an installation and exhibition as part of the Kochi Biennale. But really he wanted to create a space that we could come together as trans people within that space. So it kind of was like a space of an archive of queer and trans experience, some of his drawings because he's an artist, and a space with a bed, a table, a dressing table. It was like very much kind of a domestic space. And he invited us to do a performance with him. The whole space the installation was called Sweet Maria Monument, and it was a dedication to Maria, who was a queer trans person who was murdered. So it was also around kind of celebrating her life and also mourning and grieving collectively. So it was myself, a chosen sibling, G. Iman Samala, and Aryan Krishnan. And we decided to do an anti-performance in the end, just giving given the context of the trans body always being a spectacle and always having to kind of provide this aesthetic image versus what we spoke, versus our actual lived experiences. So we decided to do an anti-performance, and what we did was try to create this intimate space, safe space for us as queer and trans people to kind of explore our communality, to nurture ourselves in the face of death. We perform these acts of collective care, such as massaging each other. We perform these different acts of care. We also kind of shared knowledge about queer and trans experience, and spoke about the differences of being within the diaspora and within the Indian context. And it was a space that, allowed us to kind of, breathe together, to grieve together, to kind of heal together, and where we could exist, in this unapologetic way. And yes, there was an audience who had to experience that and observe that. And this is what we were also just speaking about, of how we view sick and disabled people's lives and bodies, right? So people were not forced to, but they had, if they consented to be there for the performance, they also had to witness, right? They had to witness us, this kind of trans mourning and joy, right, together in in this form of resistance. So I think I wanted to mention that because I feel like these are the ways that I'm trying to think through of what kind of representation or visibility is important for us, or what are the spaces, because also this was a space for us to come together as trans people, right, and have this collective care and collective conversation together.
Yeah, it's really important, Raju, and like really powerful work. And it's, you know, the radical act of taking care of each other and it not being, you know, for the consumption for an outside audience, and the politics of refusal, and being really central to that, and decentering the cis gaze and just the objectification that happens daily for trans people. And what that performance really speaks to the transformational and radical acts of taking care of each other, and as you said, like the anti-performance, you know, what does it do to, you know, take away from being the center of a gaze, or challenge the spectator or the viewer or the people who are then part of the performance, and challenging their role of what are they now part of, and what are they complicit in, or how do they have to challenge themselves, I think is really important. I was going to talk about a work of mine, but I think it's okay.
Oh, no, you should.
I guess just hearing you talk about your work and you know, feeling that mirror of, like, again, the anti-performance, the ways in which you know, using performance to disrupt art spaces and to challenge the viewer, and from a similar perspective of looking at the body as a site of resistance. There's a couple of performances that I've created, looms between people, and one of them, my favourite piece actually, is it's called You and I More Alike, and the first time I did it with a really good friend of mine and my mother, and I built a loom between their backs, and they're held together with thread. And this has been a theme of mine, building looms and building things about production, and how as disabled people, marginalised people, how we can resist those ideas of production placed onto bodies of colour, marginalised bodies, and the ways in which disabled bodies are seen as rejected or not functional in the role of capitalism.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you so much, Raju.
Thanks, Raisa. It was great to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you too.
Hi, everyone. Ooh, a lot of you stayed. Thanks for some of your contributions. Bryce, Raju, did you want to say anything immediately before we move to questions? Any additional thoughts that you've had after listening to yourselves? Raju's shaking their head.
I'm okay, yeah.
We've had some questions come in. I think you're... I don't think we had a chance to get to EJ's question in the last bit, did we?
No, we didn't. I was looking at that, actually. Yeah, it's a good question, because I think there's some truth in it, but I also don't want to put the onus on the trans community. I feel like the structures work so much against us that they're the ones that need to change, really, to kind of allow us to be able to kind of to function as artists. Is also this thing of, like, what does it mean to kind of have representation as a trans community? Like, does it have to be art? You know, there's a huge kind of elitism and hierarchy within the art world that kind of stops any kind of marginalized bodies entering, and you kind of have to be let in, that's the point. So the trans community are already dealing with so much more in our everyday lives. I feel like we do have our own expressions within our own communities, our own spaces, but those are diminishing because of wider issues of gentrification and community spaces closing down. So there's huge issues around that. So I don't think it's just the confidence, but in terms of the confidence of the trans community to be artistic authors, I think there's also something in there around internalized transphobia, the images, what kind of status we feel we need to reach, the kind of the celebrity model, to kind of be seen, to be visible. It's a complicated conversation, and I feel like I want to have this conversation within the trans community and not, kind of within our community to go deeper into that. But those are my initial thoughts on that.
No, I saw that question. I think it's always coming back to, ownership, agency. And the fact is that the trans image is fetishized so much. So, lots and lots of people are the authors of their own images. It's then what happens to those images, and then how are they then co-opted outside of the community. So I think it's not about growing the confidence of people. I think it's about recognizing that some artwork isn't really meant to be in a gallery, or has a different purpose. And I'll leave it at that. But resisting the kind of fetishization of those kind of images, and who takes those pictures. So about agency. So are there any other questions? Does anyone want to unmic or have a chat or say something? It'd be really nice to be a bit more interactive.
Sunil, hi Sunil. I think Sunil will come on for a quick moment just to answer some queries that we had from some of you about visibility and his choice to make illness and his experience public. Hi Sunil, welcome. Thank you.
Hi Louisa. Oh, thank you so much, Raju. And Raisa, it was great. I love people just respond to the exhibition. And I didn't really want to butt in like this, but Louisa was saying, would I just say something very briefly? And I think the essence of it is that, I'd invested so much in being gay and then being of Indian origin or being Asian in this country and all that. So when I got diagnosed, and the 80s were very separatist. So, women did women's stuff, gays did gay stuff, Black people did Black things, that kind of thing. So, and I thought if I added HIV to it, my baggage would become kind of overwhelming. Like I would have no other South Asian gay who was HIV positive was really out and wanted to participate, and I would have no. So I just also thought that I'm going to just set it aside. So I didn't touch it as subject matter till 4 years later when I was really actually not well. So I did From Here to Eternity as a kind of therapy, just a physical act of production. So I wasn't doing it so much. I did it because I got an opportunity through autograph. Mark Seeley, in fact, the curator of this show, said, look, I was in a very bad place. I had no money. I'd stopped working because of my health, and I was freelance, and then I was basically on the dole, and so he gave me £1,000 and said, do you want to make something? And I thought, I'm going to make something as a kind of therapy. So I'm trying to make this brief. So so then then of course he put out, there was an exhibition as a consequence, one, which was an autograph show that featured this work and work by Ajamu. Everybody know who Ajamu is? So he and I were involved with autograph, and it was kind of a queer autograph show in a way. And then it kind of went to bed. The work that was made for that show is actually the work in this exhibition, because it's been unseen. It's been in storage ever since. There's been no other big opportunities to get it out. And then, so that was 99. And then very fortunately, I got involved with an academic friend who helped me to get an AHRC grant to make a larger body of work. And that became Homeland Stroke, the movie, A World Without Pity. And basically what I'd done was take my personal HIV and there was a lot of information and news coming out of Africa, especially Southern Africa, about HIV spreading completely out of control. And, there was nothing coming out of India. I don't know if, you guys are probably too young to remember, but there was weird silence coming out of South Asia. It's like, they were saying things like, well, we don't have it. It's them people over there have it. We can't have it. Something about being Indian miraculously, we don't get it, kind of thing. So I basically spent 3 years trying to figure out in India itself what was happening with HIV in general. And what was happening was that a society which never wanted to talk about sex at all suddenly was confronted with having to talk about it. And they had to create spaces to talk about it. And so they ended up government-sponsored spaces for underprivileged people. And in the case of Khotis and Hijras, they provided HIV-related semi-medicalized but centers. So these appeared in all of the cities across the country. And it kind of politicized something there. And so I arrived just at the cusp of that and was able to make some encounters. But in the story, I kept it more about myself, but in we see the last 5 minutes of it. In the earlier segment, you do see more. So I think I appreciate how much you both went into all the work, and you were very good at pointing out everything that was missing. Some of it was missing partly because how it's curated, because this whole show has been presented as a very personal story, which it kind of is. And basically, I just wanted to say one thing, is that as Raju has very properly pointed out, the kind of equivalent of trans we can discuss what that really is an equivalence, but the whole history of Hijras and Khotis in the subcontinent in all of the South Asian countries is very similar. And it's had a long established history. It's a recorded history also, in a sense. It's only in the last century and a half. It's in this colonial period where they really kind of started having a particularly bad time. And but anyway, what happens to people like me when I fly in is that for me to go to kind of meet them, I would have to arrive as some kind of professional. And so although I decided that I didn't want to make images of them, because I'm really not interested in making a kind of poverty porn, a kind of pictures of people who are very disadvantaged. And that's what always happens to them. I also feel like everyone goes to South Asia and takes pictures of Hijras dancing. And I just think it's become a trope that we want to get away from. They need to tell their own stories. I don't think they need me to tell their story. They need to be empowered in some way to tell what's happened to them. But anyway, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm lecturing now, I won't. But no, one more thing, I think that the three of us, there's something that I find happens in India that happens less here, sadly, is that we don't meet often intergenerationally. So,
we were in a show together.
Yeah, in coaching.
We've been all three of us have been in a show together.
I know, but we don't you know what I mean? Hang out is what because,
yeah, no, totally. I think me and Raju are very really hold intergenerational conversations are really important and crucial to movements and activism. And and I don't think Raju was saying that the portraits were done, the Pre-Raphaelites were done like out of context. It's more kind of out of context of the exhibition, because the exhibition is amazing and it's your story and it's your life. And for me, that's what was the most arresting and amazing about it, like following this journey and the kind of the autobiography of it all. And I guess it's just challenging a little bit about where institutions or our current politics positions images of trans people. And the Pre-Raphaelites image became the poster, and there's just something a little bit jarring about that. But as you said, it's curatorial gaps and we can't fit everything into one gallery. But I think I really wanted to link
I mean, I have to say, I'll say I don't want to offend anyone, but since we do live in our little capitalist system here in London, marketing people grabbed that picture, and I knew it was not properly. It doesn't encapsulate my experience, because for me it's a picture of another kind of person, but I think some marketing people somewhere decided this is going to sell it to the British public, and they put it everywhere in the tube, and people have responded to it. So maybe they know something I don't. And so this is I think as us and producers, we have this constant unsettled situation with, but on the other hand, that picture, in fact, all the Pre-Raphaelite pictures, all the people in them were people that I hung out with. So they were also the activists. And so I've always shot people that I know and that I work with. So that's what made that possible. So that was.
We understand. We understand you can't do everything, but there are, as Raisa said, there are these wider questions and wider questions about when you make an image and when it's put out there, what happens, and some of that is beyond our control as well. And like the fact that they're in the tube, I'm really curious about that. I didn't know that. So what is that doing in interrupting that space in a way, or how everyday people who use the tube, right, who wouldn't come into a gallery, how are they going to engage with that? That's actually quite interesting. But there are these wider questions, and having these things in there, as I said, raises these questions of where are we at as a queer and trans community or artist within the art world as well. So it's it's just kind of bouncing off your show to kind of talk about these other issues.
And also, so I think Raju, you had mentioned about the context of that project. So it was made before it was legalized, and it was made for exhibition. So in a sense, when I came to live in India, I was very aware from my 80s, 90s experience in London that we've got to put images out there because there was absolute invisibility. So it was very important to me that non-victim pictures were put out in some way, and they went from the gallery into the Indian mass media at a time when it was still illegal. And so it was, for me, that in that sense, they were activists. The motivation was to get them out into society, because you can't believe what the silence was like. It's only recently they even begun, in the last decade, to discuss things.
Completely.
Thanks for giving us that context, Sunil. We really appreciate that. And also, we spoke about the archive being so important. The archive that goes with the show is great, as well as the show, the images themselves, the work themselves. It's really important for us to have insight intergenerationally as well as transnationally.
Yeah, if everyone's listening in, we know that galleries are closed at the moment, but I don't know if there's a way to get hold of the catalogue, which is an amazing documentation of Sunil's life and work, and archival material and letters, and it really you know, is a kind of testament to the kind of activism that he was a part of, and from different geographies and different places. And it's wonderful just to have it all in one place. And yeah, definitely seek that out. Thank you so much, Sunil. There's one question.
Thank you.
Let's hang.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's one question.
I'll tell you what happened to Can I tell you what happened to Exiles? So in 87, it opened at the Photographers Gallery. No response from anyone. There was just like color pictures of ethnic people in India. Nobody had anything to say about it. And then it just died a death. And in 99, like 11, 12 years later, we put them up in the Dominion Center in Southall, you know, which had reopened as a cultural center. And at the opening, there was a riot because people said there were a bunch of lies. There were no gay people in India. I was making it up, you know, so the poor people who were involved in the space also got caught up. It was Manjeet, and she had a lot of hassle. People attacked the pictures, and they closed the show, and they fired Manjeet and she lost her job running the place. It was crazy reaction. And it was in the local newspapers. So it was quite dramatic. My exit from India was very dramatic too, because somebody called the police to the opening of Sun City, and they made me close the show. So I had to leave because things are getting pretty extreme there.
We spoke about that a little bit in the video. I think that got cut out as well, but how this spans, you know, globally, it spans different cultural contexts and countries, but also time span, and, you know, understandings around kind of identity over time, how things have changed. All of that is also another conversation, right? To have in the different kind of, and it was so good to kind of hear around Clause 28 and the pretended families for that reason, and that work is really important. For that reason as well. But thanks for sharing that. I feel like we could speak forever about this.
I know.
Yeah.
Louise, how are we doing for time? What?
Not great.
We need to wrap.
We do. Thank you, Sunil. I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to get to everyone's comments and contributions and questions, but we really do appreciate it. My colleague has just circulated, by the way, a link to the exhibition book, but here it is. It really is fantastic, and I think it's so different from other exhibition publications that it feels like a working document. I think with the paper, it feels very active. So thank you for sharing that with us, Sunil. Thank you to Raisa Kabir and Raju, to Sunil Gupta always, to my colleagues Janice McLaren and Francesca Pinto for the support in getting tonight off the ground, and of course to the Georgia Bangladesh Foundation again. Lastly, to you all for your ongoing commitment to the gallery. We really wouldn't be able to do what we do without you, so thank you. Again, I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of your comments, but thank you nonetheless for your contributions tonight. If you have a moment, we'd love to hear from you. We'll be doing a quick poll at the end of this to get some feedback. Anyway, I hope you're all okay, and please check our website for information on the exciting symposium that we are holding in January. Sunil, I need to tell you about that more. For this exhibition and for updates on other forthcoming program. Thank you again, and see you all soon.
Thank you.
You guys can stay on, by the way.
Okay, bye.
I'll stop recording if you guys wanted to chat, by the way.